"Don't touch her," the old man said, low enough that only the wind and the horses could hear it. "Because some people ain't meant to be handled the way the world handles the rest." Folks around Copper Ridge didn't think much of Eliza Whitmore the day she stepped down from that noon train. Just a thin woman in a faded calico dress, dust clinging to the hem like it had already claimed her, her carpet bag small enough to tell a whole story before she ever opened her mouth. And when Caleb Hayes saw her standing there at the edge of the platform, eyes steady but quiet, he didn't see anything special either. Not like the other women who had come through before, the ones with brighter dresses or louder laughter or hands soft enough to promise comfort. No, Eliza looked like someone the world had already passed over once and wasn't planning to circle back for. And maybe that was why he chose her. Or maybe it was because she didn't ask to be chosen at all, just stood there like she understood how things worked and didn't expect them to bend for her. And that kind of stillness, in a place where everything fought to be seen, had a way of settling into a man whether he meant for it to or not. The town didn't approve. Of course they didn't. Whispers followed them from the platform to the wagon. Words like useless and poor pick drifting behind like loose dust. But Eliza never turned her head, never tried to explain herself. She climbed into the back of Caleb's wagon with careful hands, not waiting for help, not pretending she didn't need it either, just doing what had to be done. And that was the first thing he noticed later on, though he wouldn't have said it out loud. She didn't reach for more than what was offered, but she didn't shrink from it either. The road out to his ranch stretched near 8 miles of dry land and low wind, the kind that gets into your clothes and stays there, and neither of them spoke much. The wheels creaked, the mule stepped steady, and somewhere between the town and that small house sitting quiet against the horizon, something settled between them, not comfort, not yet, but something close to understanding the kind that doesn't need words to make itself known. When they reached the place, it looked like it always did, a cabin that had seen better years and wasn't asking for new ones, the porch boards worn, the door hanging just a little off its frame, inside a table, 2 chairs, and the kind of silence that had been sitting there longer than any man ought to leave it alone. Caleb set her bag down by the door and told her plain, "You'll have your own space. I don't expect much. Just keep the place running." And she nodded once like she'd been given something more than that, though there wasn't much to see. And when he stepped outside to tend the mule, he half expected her to stand there uncertain, maybe look lost the way most did when they realized what they'd traded for a promise. But when he came back in, she was already moving, slow and careful, setting her bag down, brushing dust from the table with the edge of her sleeve, not trying to change the place, just making it usable. And it was such a small thing that he almost missed it. But there it was, something shifting in a house that had stayed the same too long. And later, when the light dropped low and the cold started creeping in from the edges, she lit the stove without asking where the kindling was, found it like she knew how to look for things instead of waiting to be told. And when she set 2 plates on the table, simple tin, nothing special, Caleb paused just a second longer than he meant to, because it had been a long time since that table had held more than one. And he didn't say anything about it, just sat down when she did. The quiet between them different now, not empty the way it used to be, but not full either, something in between, something waiting. And across the table, Eliza Whitmore ate her meal without hurry, without apology, like she belonged there just enough to stay, and not enough to claim it. And somewhere outside, that same wind carried a voice through memory or distance, hard to tell which. "Don't touch her." It said again, softer this time, like a warning meant for later, and Caleb, without knowing why, felt it settle deeper than it should have. The next morning came in quiet, the kind that settles over a place before the sun has made up its mind to rise. And Caleb woke to a sound he had not heard in years, the steady rhythm of someone moving in his kitchen, not loud, not careless, just present, like it belonged there. And for a moment he stayed where he was, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to it, the soft scrape of a chair leg, the low crackle of kindling catching flame, the faint clink of tin against wood, and something in his chest tightened in a way he could not quite place. Not discomfort, not exactly, but not ease either. When he stepped into the main room, the air had already changed, warmer by a few degrees, carrying the smell of coffee strong enough to wake a man properly. And there she was, Eliza, standing at the stove with her sleeves rolled just enough to keep them from the flame, her movements measured, Not rushed, not hesitant. As if she had been in that kitchen longer than a single night, she did not turn when he entered, only said, "Coffee is ready," in that same steady voice she had used the day before, and he grunted something that might have been thanks or might not, reaching for a cup without asking where it was kept, though he noticed, without meaning to, that she had already set it closer to the edge of the shelf where his hand would find it easier. Small things like that did not go unnoticed, even if he did not speak on them. They sat at the table again. 2 plates, 2 cups, the morning light slipping through the window in thin lines that caught the dust in the air, and for a while there was nothing but the sound of eating, the scrape of fork against tin, the fire settling in the stove. Outside a fence creaked in the wind, same as it always did, but inside something had shifted just enough to make the silence feel different, less like something pressing in and more like something holding steady. After he finished, Caleb stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and reached for his hat. "I will be out by the south fence," he said, not looking at her. "Needs fixing before the hogs find it again." She nodded once, like she had already considered it, and when he stepped outside, the air felt sharper than before, or maybe it was just him noticing more. The ranch stretched out the same as yesterday, dry land, scattered brush, work waiting in every direction. But when he reached the fence line an hour later and dropped his tools to the ground, he heard something behind him, slow at first, then steady, and when he turned, there she was again, Eliza, walking across the field with a length of timber balanced in both hands, not dragging it, not struggling loud enough to make a point of it, just carrying it the way a person carries something because it needs carrying. Her dress caught the wind at the hem, dust clung to her boots, but she did not stop until she reached him, setting the timber down beside the broken rail with a quiet thud. "This should hold better," she said, brushing her hands once against her skirt, and he stared at the wood, then at her. Not because a woman could not carry a thing like that, but because she had not asked if she should, had not waited to be told, and more than that, she had chosen the right piece, straight, solid, not too green, not too dry, the kind that would last through more than one season. "You walked the property," he said, more statement than question, and she nodded again. "I wanted to know what needed doing," she answered, simple as that, and for a moment he did not respond, just picked up his hammer and set to work. But he noticed how she held the post steady while he drove the nails, not shifting when the weight pressed down, not flinching when the wood knocked against her palm, steady, always steady. They worked like that for a while without speaking, the rhythm of it settling into something familiar, though it had never been shared before, and when the fence stood straight again, Caleb stepped back, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked at the line they had repaired together. It was better than it had been before, stronger, cleaner, and he found himself saying, without quite planning to, "We will check the north side tomorrow," and she only nodded, like she had already expected that too. And as they walked back toward the house, the wind at their backs, he realized something small but certain. The place did not feel as empty as it had the day before, and he could not yet explain why. By the third morning, the house no longer felt like something abandoned, though Caleb would not have said it that way if asked. He only noticed that he woke before the cold had settled too deep into the walls, and that the fire had already been coaxed back to life before he stepped out of his room. The kettle set just off the hottest part of the stove so it would not boil over, a detail small enough to miss unless a man had lived long enough to know the difference. Eliza moved the same as before, quiet, steady, not looking for acknowledgement, and yet the space around her seemed to hold its shape better, like things had found their place without being told where to go. He drank his coffee standing this time, watching the light come in through the window, pale and slow, and he noticed how the table had been cleared not just of dishes but of dust that had settled in the grain of the wood for years, rubbed out in careful strokes. Not perfect, but deliberate. "Town run today, he said after a while, his voice rough from sleep. "Need to check on supplies," she nodded, as she always did. But then she reached to the shelf and pulled down a folded paper he had not seen before, setting it on the table between them, the edges creased clean, the writing neat and even. "You might need this," she said, and he frowned slightly, not at her, but at the fact that she had written anything at all. He unfolded it and found a list, not long, not crowded, but ordered in a way that made immediate sense. Flour, salt, nails, lamp oil. Each item placed where it belonged, not by size or by habit, but by what would run out first, what would last, what would cost the most if delayed. He read it once, then again, slower. And when he looked up, she was already turning back to the stove, as if the matter was settled. "You wrote this," he said, and she answered without turning. It seemed easier that way. Simple words. Nothing more, but something in them stayed with him longer than it should have. The ride into town took near an hour, the wagon moving steady over dry ground, and Caleb found himself glancing at that folded paper more than once. The lines of it clean, the spacing exact, not the kind of thing most folks put together when they were guessing. When he reached Copper Ridge, the usual sounds met him: boots on wood, voices carrying low through the open doors, the smell of tobacco and feed and sun-warmed leather. Nothing had changed there, not really. But when he stepped into the general store and handed over the list, the clerk, a narrow man named Peters who had seen more seasons than he cared to count, took one look at the paper and raised his brow just slightly. Not enough to call attention, but enough for Caleb to notice. "You got help now," Peters said, turning the paper in his hands like it might tell him more than it already had. Caleb shrugged. "Something like that," he answered, and Peters nodded once, slow, thoughtful, then began pulling the items without asking for clarification. No questions about quantities, no second guesses, as if the list itself had already done the talking. And that was when Caleb felt it. Not suspicion exactly, but a shift, small and quiet, like something just out of place enough to be noticed if a man was paying attention. When he returned to the ranch later that afternoon, the sun low and the shadows long, he found Eliza outside near the side of the house, a piece of paper in her hand, though she folded it quickly when she saw him, slipping it into the pocket of her apron without a word. "Everything all right?" he asked, setting the supplies down by the door, and she nodded. "Same as always." "Yes," she said, but her eyes moved just once, toward the road, then back again, and it was a small thing, easy to miss. But Caleb had spent enough years watching land and weather to know when something did not quite sit right. He did not press her, not then, just carried the goods inside, set them on the table, and watched as she unpacked them, placing each item where it belonged without hesitation, like she had known the space long before she arrived. And when she came to the nails, she paused just a moment, weighing them in her hand before setting them aside. "We will need more than this," she said, not as a complaint, but as a fact. And he looked at her then, really looked this time, and for a brief second, something passed between them, something he could not name, not yet, but it stayed with him all the same, like a question waiting for the right time to be asked. The wind picked up that evening, not strong enough to trouble anything built well, but enough to remind a man what had not been built right. And Caleb stood on the porch a while longer than usual, looking out over the stretch of land that carried more work than it showed at first glance. The fence they had fixed held steady, the post straight against the horizon. But beyond that, the north line leaned just enough to catch his eye again, and he knew he would have to see to it sooner than later. Behind him, through the open door, he could hear the soft movement of Eliza in the kitchen, the quiet rhythm of things being set in place. Not hurried, not delayed, just done. When he stepped back inside, the warmth met him before anything else, the kind that settles into the bones slow and steady. The table already set the same way it had been the past few nights. 2 plates, even portions, nothing more than needed, nothing less. And he found himself pausing again at the sight of it, not because it was new, but because it had not been there before she came, and now it was, like it had always belonged. They ate in that same quiet, but it had changed again, not by much, just enough that he did not feel the need to leave the table the moment his plate was empty. And when he finally leaned back, wiping his hands slow against his trousers, she reached for the empty cups without asking, stacking them near the edge of the table where he would not have to move them later. Small things. Always small things, but they added up in ways he was beginning to notice. "North fence in the morning," he said, and she nodded. "We will need more posts," she answered, not guessing, not suggesting, just stating it plain, and he looked at her a moment, then gave a short nod. "I will bring them from the barn," he said. But the next morning, when he stepped out toward the barn before the sun had cleared the ridge, he found the first 2 posts already laid out near the fence line, set where they would be needed, not dragged carelessly, but placed with purpose. And he stood there a second, looking at them, then back toward the house. The door closed, smoke just beginning to rise thin from the chimney, and something in him shifted again, not sharp, not sudden, just enough to make him aware of it. By the time he reached the fence, she was already there, hands wrapped around another length of timber, holding it upright while the wind tugged at her skirt. And he did not ask how she had managed it, did not ask when she had started. He only took his place beside her and began the work. The sound of hammer against nail carried across the field in a steady rhythm, and for a while, that was all there was, the work, the wind, and the space between them that no longer felt empty. When they paused, Caleb wiped his brow with the back of his hand and glanced down at the ground where she had set her tools, not scattered, not left where they fell, but lined just enough to be reached without looking. And it was that, more than anything else, that caught him, the way she arranged things like she expected them to matter later, like she had learned somewhere that disorder cost more than time. "You have done this before," he said, not looking at her directly. And there was a brief silence, not long, but long enough to be noticed, before she answered, "I have done what needed doing." And it was not an answer that gave anything away, but it was not one that hid either. It simply stood where it was, and he let it, because pressing further did not feel right. Not yet. Later that afternoon, as they walked back toward the house, a rider appeared on the far edge of the property, small against the distance at first, then clearer as he drew closer, a man from town, hat low, posture stiff in the saddle. And Caleb slowed his step just slightly, watching, not with concern, but with that same awareness he had carried since the day before. Beside him, Eliza did not stop, did not step back. She only turned her head once toward the rider, then forward again, her pace unchanged. And that was when Caleb noticed it, not in what she did, but in what she did not do. No hesitation, no question, just a quiet certainty that settled around her like something unseen, and he could not explain it, but he felt it all the same, like the edge of a story he had not yet been told. The rider did not hurry, and that alone told Caleb more than if the man had come fast, dust trailing and urgency in his posture. No, this one came steady, like he had all the time in the world, or believed he did. The horse picked its way across the dry ground with the ease of something that knew the distance would not change no matter how it was taken, and by the time he reached the front of the house, Caleb was already there, standing near the porch, one hand resting against the rail, not tense, not relaxed, just waiting the way a man waits when he expects to be addressed. The rider pulled up a few yards short, swung down from the saddle with a small grunt, boots hitting the dirt firm and certain. He brushed a hand over his coat, as if the road had left something on him he did not care to carry further. "Haze," he said, voice even, not unfriendly, not warm, just measured. Caleb gave a slight nod. "What brings you out here?" The man glanced past him toward the house, just for a second, but it was enough. "Name is Carter," he said. "I handle matters for the county when they come up." And that word, matters, sat in the air a moment longer than it needed to. Caleb did not move. "What kind of matters?" Carter reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, not worn like something carried long, but fresh, the creases still sharp. He did not hand it over right away, just held it between his fingers like it meant something more than ink and weight. "There has been a question raised about this land," he said, and now there was something else in his tone, not quite authority, but close enough to be heard that way. "Records, boundaries, claims that may not have been settled proper." Caleb felt the words settle into him slow, not because he did not understand them, but because he did, and he knew what they could mean if left unchecked. "This land has been mine for years," he said, not louder, not sharper, just steady. Carter nodded once. "I am not saying it is not," he replied, "only that someone has taken interest in reviewing it." And he held the paper out then. But before Caleb could reach for it, the door behind him opened soft on its hinges, and Eliza stepped out onto the porch, not hurried, not cautious, just present. And something changed, not in the air exactly, but in the space between the three of them. Carter's hand paused, just for a fraction, the paper still held between his fingers, and his eyes shifted, not fully, but enough to catch her standing there, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her expression the same as it had always been, calm, unreadable. She did not step forward, did not speak, only stood where she was, and that was when Caleb noticed it, the smallest thing, but it settled heavier than it should have. Carter straightened slightly, not in a way that drew attention, but in a way that a man does when he realizes he is no longer the one setting the tone. He cleared his throat once, then extended the paper again, this time fully, just a formality, he said. Though the word did not carry the same weight it had a moment before, Caleb took it, eyes scanning the lines. But his attention was split now, not on the words alone, but on what had just passed without being spoken. Beside him, Eliza remained still, her gaze not on the paper, not on Carter, but somewhere just beyond them both, as if she had already seen the shape of things before they arrived. And after a moment, Carter stepped back, a small motion, easy to miss. "I will return in a few days," he said, adjusting his coat again. "Give you time to review." Caleb gave a short nod, still holding the paper, still feeling that shift settle into something he could not yet name. Carter mounted his horse without another word, turned it toward the road, and rode off the same way he had come, steady, unhurried, but not quite the same as before. And when the dust settled behind him, the quiet returned, but it was not the same quiet as before either. Caleb lowered the paper slowly, then turned just slightly toward Eliza, who had not moved, not asked, not reacted, only stood there like she had been expecting this moment long before it arrived. And for the first time, the question in his mind did not feel distant anymore. It felt close, like it was already waiting for an answer. Caleb stood there a long moment after the rider disappeared over the rise, the paper still in his hand, though he was no longer reading it. The edges pressed lightly between his fingers like something that had weight beyond what it showed. Behind him, the door creaked once as Eliza stepped back inside, not waiting, not asking, just moving as she always did, and that quiet departure settled into him more than any words might have. He followed after a few seconds, ducking his head through the doorway, the familiar smell of coffee and wood smoke meeting him again, steady, grounding. She was at the table now, one hand resting near the edge, the other smoothing something unseen from the surface, not cleaning, not exactly, just making things right where they were. He set the paper down in front of her without speaking, not offering it, not pulling it back, just placing it there between them like the truth of it belonged to the space more than to either of them. She looked at it then, not quickly, not with surprise, but with the same measured attention she gave to everything, her eyes moving across the lines once, then again slower, and when she lifted her gaze, it did not go to him first, but to the window, where the light had shifted slightly, the afternoon settling in. "This was coming," she said, and it was not a question, not even a guess, just a statement set down as plain as the wood beneath her hand. Caleb pulled out the chair and sat across from her, the scrape of it against the floor louder than it needed to be. "You knew," he said, not accusing, not yet, but the words held something firmer than before. She folded the paper once, careful along the crease, then set it back on the table, aligning it with the grain of the wood, as if it mattered. How it rested there. "I expected something like it," she answered, and that was all, not more, not less. He watched her a moment, the way she did not rush to explain, did not offer more than what was asked, and for the first time, the space between them felt like it held something unsaid on purpose, not by accident. "Who would take interest in this land?" he asked after a pause, and she met his eyes then, steady, calm, not avoiding, but not revealing either. "Someone who believes it belongs elsewhere," she said, and again, it was enough to answer and not enough to settle anything. Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying a dry sound across the yard, something loose brushing against the side of the barn. Caleb leaned back slightly, one hand resting on the table now, closer than before, not reaching, just present. "And you," he said slowly. "You knew before today." She did not look away, but there was the smallest change in her expression, not fear, not even hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement of something already understood. "I have seen this before," she said, and there was a weight to that word, seen, that did not belong to guesswork or chance. He studied her then, the way she held herself, the way she chose each word like it mattered how it was placed, and something began to take shape in his mind. not clear yet, but forming, like the outline of something just beneath the surface. "You are not what they said you were," he said finally, not as a question, but as something closer to realization. And for the first time since he had met her, Eliza allowed the faintest shift at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but something that acknowledged the truth without claiming it. "No," she said softly, and the word did not carry pride or apology, only certainty. They sat there in that quiet again, but it had changed once more, deeper now, holding more than before. And when Caleb reached for the paper again, it no longer felt like something handed to him from outside. It felt like something that had already been part of his life longer than he had known. And across from him, Eliza remained still, her hands resting lightly on the table, as if she had been waiting for him to arrive. At this moment in his own time, and not before. That evening settled slower than the ones before it, like the land itself was holding its breath, and Caleb found himself outside again, not because there was more work to be done, but because staying inside felt different now, heavier in a way he could not yet name. The sky stretched wide above the ranch, streaked with fading gold and long shadows, and the fence line they had repaired stood straight against it, a quiet proof of something built together, though neither of them had spoken of it. That way, behind him, the door opened soft, and he did not need to turn to know it was her. Eliza stepped out onto the porch, her hands empty, her posture the same as always, calm, steady, like she carried nothing she did not choose to carry. She did not come to stand beside him, not quite, but close enough that he could feel her presence without needing to see it. And for a while, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the dry grass, low and constant, the kind of sound that filled space. Without asking permission, "You have seen this before," Caleb said finally, not looking at her, his eyes still on the horizon where the last light was fading. She did not answer right away, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, like it was holding something that needed to settle before it could be said. "Yes," she replied at last, and there was something in her voice now, not different exactly, but deeper, as if the word carried more than just agreement. He shifted his weight slightly, one hand resting against the porch rail, worn smooth by years of use. "Then you know how it ends," he said, and there was no fear in it, no demand, just a quiet question placed where it could be left or answered. She turned her head just enough to look toward the land, not at him, not away, just out. "It depends on who stands their ground," she said, and the words settled between them like something that belonged there, steady, unforced. He let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding, the kind that comes when a man recognizes something without fully understanding it yet. Inside the house, the stove gave a soft crack as the fire shifted, a reminder of warmth waiting just beyond the door, but neither of them moved toward it. "Not yet. You are not afraid," he said after a while, and this time he did glance at her, just once, enough to see that her expression had not changed, not in the way most would expect, no tension, no worry, just that same quiet certainty. She met his gaze then, and for the first time, there was something else there, not guarded, not hidden, just present. "Fear does not change what is already set in motion," she said, and it was not spoken like something she believed, but like something she had learned, long before this place, long before him. The wind shifted again, cooler now, carrying the promise of night settling in, and Caleb straightened slightly, not in resistance, not in readiness, just in acknowledgement of what stood before him. "They will come back," he said, more to the air than to her, but she answered all the same. Yes, simple, certain, and again. "Enough?" He nodded once, slow, his gaze returning to the land, the fence, the house behind him, all of it. And for the first time since the rider had arrived, the weight of it did not sit on him the same way. It had not lessened, not exactly, but it had shifted, like something shared carried differently than something borne alone. Beside him, Eliza rested her hand lightly on the edge of the porch rail, not touching his, not reaching, just there, close enough that the space between them felt smaller than it had before, and neither of them moved away from it. The last of the light faded from the sky, leaving the land in that quiet in-between where shapes softened and edges blurred. And in that stillness, Caleb realized something that had been building without his notice. Whatever had come with her to this place, whatever past she carried without speaking, It was not something that would pass through and leave things unchanged. It had already begun to settle into the bones of the land, into the rhythm of the house, into the space between two people who had started as strangers and now stood in something quieter, something steadier, something that had not yet been named, but was no longer empty. Morning came with a thin layer of frost, settled over the ground, not heavy enough to stop work, but enough to make each step sound sharper than it should. And Caleb rose before the light had fully reached the window, the habit of years pulling him from sleep without effort. But when he stepped into the main room, the fire was already lit again, steady and low, the kettle placed just right, and Eliza stood by the table with a piece of paper spread flat beneath her hand. She did not hide it this time when he entered, only looked up once, then back down as if what she was doing did not need explanation. He poured his coffee, the heat of it settling into his hands, and watched her a moment longer than usual. The way her fingers moved across the page, not writing now, but tracing lines, checking something against memory rather than sight. "What is that?" he asked, not sharp, but not as quiet as before either. She turned the paper slightly toward him, not offering it fully, just enough for him to see that it was not a letter. Not exactly, but something drawn, measured, the lines clean and deliberate, sections marked in a way that suggested more than guesswork. "Your land," she said, and that alone was enough to make him step closer, the boards creaking under his weight as he moved, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked down at it. The boundaries laid out clearer than anything he had ever been shown, the north line, the south fence, the well, even the low ridge that cut across the far end of the property, all of it placed with a precision that did not belong to memory alone. "You drew this," he said, and she nodded once. "From what I have seen," she answered, but there was something in her tone that suggested she had seen more than just this place. Outside, a horse approached again, the sound of hooves carrying over the cold ground before the rider came into view, and this time, Caleb did not need to step out to meet him, because he already knew who it would be. Carter rode up the same as before, steady, measured, but when he dismounted, there was a difference, small, but there, his posture straighter, his gaze more careful, like he had already decided something before arriving. Caleb stepped onto the porch, the paper still in his hand, and Eliza followed after a moment, not behind him, not ahead, just present. Carter removed his hat this time, not fully, just enough to acknowledge something that had not been acknowledged before. "I trust you have had time," he said, but his eyes did not stay on Caleb long. They shifted again, not openly, but enough to be noticed, toward Eliza, who stood with her hands resting lightly at her sides. The same as always, calm, unmoved. Caleb held the paper out, but not the one Carter had given him, the one Eliza had drawn, and Carter hesitated, just for a second, before taking it, his eyes moving across the lines, slower than before, more careful, and the change was clearer now, not in his words, but in the way he held himself, the way his shoulders set, the way his breath shifted. "This is accurate," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that had not been there the day before, something closer to respect than authority. He glanced up then, not at Caleb, but at Eliza, and for a moment, the air held still. "Ma'am," he added, quiet, almost under his breath, and it was not a word he had used before, not here, not with her. Caleb felt that shift again, stronger this time, not just something sensed, but something seen, and beside him, Eliza did not react, did not acknowledge the change. She only stood as she had from the beginning, steady, certain, as if none of this surprised her. Carter folded the paper carefully, not the quick, careless crease of before, but with attention, aligning the edges before handing it back. "There will be no further questions," he said, and the words carried weight now. Final, settled. He placed his hat back on his head, but not before giving a slight nod, not to Caleb, but to her. And when he mounted his horse again, the way he held the reins had changed, the confidence still there, but tempered by something else, something that recognized a boundary not written on any map. And as he rode away, the dust rising behind him, Caleb stood still on the porch, the paper in his hand, the land stretching out before him the same as it had always been, and yet not the same at all, because now he understood. Something he had only begun to feel before. Whatever Eliza Whitmore carried with her, It was not something that could be questioned, not by men like Carter, not by anyone who knew what they were looking at. And beside him, she remained as she always had, quiet, steady, untouched by the shift she had caused, like it had never been a question to begin with. The quiet after Carter left did not break all at once. It settled slowly, like dust finding its place again, and Caleb remained on the porch longer than before, the paper still in his hand, though he no longer needed to look at it, because what it had shown him was no longer in the lines or the ink. It was standing beside him, silent as ever. Eliza did not speak when the writer disappeared from view. She only turned slightly and stepped back inside, the door closing with that same soft sound that had come to mark her presence. And for a moment, Caleb stayed where he was, looking out over the land that had not changed, and yet felt entirely different now. When he finally followed her in, the house carried that steady warmth again, the table cleared, the stove holding its quiet heat, and she was there, moving as she always did, placing things where they belonged, as if nothing of consequence had just passed, as if men did not shift their tone and their posture the moment they looked at her. He set the paper down on the table, slower this time, watching her as she reached for it, not with urgency, not with curiosity, just with that same measured care, folding it once, aligning the edges, setting it aside like it had already served its purpose. "That is it then," he said, and his voice carried something new, not tension, not relief, but a kind of understanding that had not been there before. She nodded once. "For now," she replied, and the words held more than they offered, enough to make him pause. "There will be more," he said, and it was not a question. She met his eyes then, steady as always. "There is always more," she answered, and for the first time, there was something in her gaze that felt closer to invitation than distance, not asking, not offering, just allowing him to see what had always been there if he had looked closely enough. He pulled out the chair and sat, not because he was tired, but because standing felt like something from before, and this moment did not belong to before anymore. She moved to the stove, lifting the lid of the pot, stirring once with slow, even motion, the kind that spoke of patience rather than habit, and the smell of supper began to fill the room. Simple, steady, enough, and it struck him then. Not sharp, not sudden, but clear. Everything she did held that same quality, not more than needed, not less than required, just enough to make things hold, to make them last. "You could have told me," he said after a while, and the words came without edge, without demand, just placed there between them. She set the spoon down and turned slightly, not fully facing him, but enough that he could see her expression, unchanged, calm, certain. "You would not have believed me," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only truth, and he let out a breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh, though it held no humor, only recognition. "No," he admitted, and that was the first time he had said something that felt entirely honest without needing to measure it. The light outside shifted again, the day moving forward without waiting for either of them, and inside, the space between them settled into something that no longer needed filling. It simply was. He watched her as she moved back to the table, placing two plates as she always did, even, balanced, and he noticed how natural it had become, how expected, and for a moment, he thought back to the first day, to the whispers at the station, to the word they had used, useless, and it no longer fit, not even close. It had never fit, only he had not known it yet. "Untouchable," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, but the word carried, and she paused just slightly, her hand resting near the edge of the table, not pulling back, not reaching forward, just there. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, but no less certain. "Not in the way they think," she said, and he looked at her then, really looked, and understood that whatever line had been drawn around her, whatever place she stood, that others recognized without needing to be told, it was not built on fear or distance. It was built on something deeper, something earned or carried or both, and for the first time, he did not feel outside of it. He felt close enough to see it clearly, and that changed more than anything else had so far, because it was no longer about what she was not. It was about what she had always been, and what that meant for both of them moving forward. The next few days did not bring trouble the way a man might expect it. No riders at dawn, no voices raised at the edge of the land, no sudden demands that needed answering. And yet something had changed all the same. Something quiet but certain, like a line had been drawn, and now everyone knew where it stood. Caleb felt it first when he rode into town again, not because anything was said outright, but because of what was not said. The usual talk slowed when he stepped into the store. The glances came quicker and left faster. And Peters, who had always spoken plain without much thought for how it landed, measured his words now, just slightly. "Everything holding steady out your way?" he asked, not looking directly at Caleb, and Caleb nodded once. "It is," he answered, and that was enough. No more questions followed, no second looks. Just a quiet understanding that settled into the space between men who knew when something had shifted beyond their reach. When he stepped back, outside, the sun sat high, warming the boards beneath his boots, but the air carried that same difference, like the place had adjusted itself around something unseen. Back at the ranch, Eliza moved through the day the same as always. Nothing in her manner changed. She worked where work needed doing, the fence line now straight, the tools set where they would be found again, the house holding its warmth without effort. And yet Caleb saw it more clearly now, not just what she did, but how she did it, the way she chose each movement, each word, like it mattered in ways most people never considered. That afternoon, as he repaired a hinge on the barn door, he heard the sound of paper behind him, a soft fold, then another, and when he turned, she stood there with a letter in her hand, not hidden, not offered, just held. "It will be delivered tomorrow," she said, and he frowned slightly, not at her, but at the certainty in her voice. "To who?" he asked, and she met his gaze without hesitation. "Someone who ensures things remain as they are meant to be," she answered, and there it was again, not explanation, not evasion, just a truth placed where it could stand on its own. He nodded slowly, accepting it without needing to press further, because pressing no longer felt like the right way forward. "You trust them," he said, and she paused just long enough for him to notice. "I trust what they represent," she replied, and that was enough, more than enough. The wind moved through the open barn, carrying the scent of dry wood and distant rain that might not come for days, and Caleb returned to his work, but his thoughts did not settle the same way they once had. They moved around something new, something that had taken root without asking permission. That evening, as they sat at the table again, the same two plates, the same steady quiet, he noticed another small thing. She waited, not for him to sit, not for him to speak, but simply until the moment felt right, and when she began to eat, it was with that same calm certainty that marked everything she did. He set his fork down after a while, not because he was finished, but because the thought had come and would not leave. "Why here?" he asked, and the question carried more than the words themselves. She looked at him, not surprised, not guarded, just present. "Because it was not claimed by anyone who understood its worth," she said, and the answer settled deeper than he expected, not because of what it meant for the land, but because of what it suggested about her, about the way she saw things, about the way she chose where to stand. He nodded once, slow, taking it in, and for a moment, neither of them spoke again. The fire in the stove crackled softly, the night settling in around the house, and Caleb realized something that had been building without his notice. Whatever had begun when she stepped off that train, whatever had followed her to this place, it had not only changed how others saw the land, it had changed how he saw it too, not just as something to hold, but as something to understand. And across the table, Eliza Whitmore sat in that same quiet way she always had, but now he knew that quiet was not emptiness. It was something far more solid, something that did not need to be touched to be known. The letter left the ranch the next morning with a rider who did not ask questions and did not linger, just took the folded paper from Eliza's hand with a small nod and turned his horse back toward town. And Caleb watched it go the same way he had watched everything else since she arrived, not trying to follow it, not trying to stop it, just taking in what it meant without needing it explained. The days that followed carried a different kind of quiet, not the empty kind he had known before, but one that felt settled, like something had been decided beyond his sight and the land itself was waiting for it to take shape. Work continued as it always did. Fences held, the barn door swung clean on its hinge, the well gave steady water with each pull, and Eliza moved through it all with that same careful rhythm. But now he noticed more, not just what she did, but how others responded to what she had set in motion. A wagon passed by on the far road one afternoon, slower than usual, the driver tipping his hat toward the house, though he had no reason to stop, and Caleb caught it. That small gesture, that acknowledgement of something not spoken. Later, when he rode into town again, it was clearer still. Carter stood outside the general store speaking with two men Caleb knew well, but when Caleb approached, the conversation shifted, not ending, just changing direction, and Carter stepped aside slightly, not in deference to him, but in recognition of something that stood behind him. Something that had not been there before. "Hayes," Carter said, his tone even, but different now, less certain of itself. "Everything remains in order," and Caleb nodded once. "It does," he replied, and that was enough. No further mention of land or claims or boundaries, just a quiet agreement that what had been questioned no longer was. When he returned to the ranch that evening, the sun low and the air cooling, he found Eliza sitting on the porch, not working, not moving, just there, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze set out across the land as if she was seeing something beyond it. He slowed as he approached, not wanting to break whatever stillness she held, but she turned her head slightly before he reached the steps, as if she had already known he was there. "It is done," she said, and the words carried no weight of effort, no sign of what it had taken to bring them about, just a quiet certainty that it had been completed. He stepped up onto the porch, removing his hat, not out of habit this time, but because it felt right. "The letter," he said, and she nodded once. "It reached where it needed to go," she answered, and there was nothing more to it. No explanation of who had read it, no account of what had been said in return, only the result, and that was all that mattered. He leaned against the porch rail, the wood familiar beneath his hand, but the feeling of it different now, like he was standing in a place that had shifted without moving. "You knew it would," he said, and she did not deny it. "I knew it could," she replied, and that distinction settled into him. The difference between certainty and possibility, between forcing something and allowing it to unfold. They sat there in that quiet again, but now it held something else, something shared, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The wind moved soft across the field, the fence line straight and steady in the distance, and Caleb realized that whatever had come with her, whatever past she carried that shaped the way others saw her without being told, it had not only protected what he had built, it had strengthened it, given it something he had not known it lacked. And beside him, Eliza remained as she always had, quiet, composed, untouched by the change she had brought, but no longer unseen, not by him, not anymore. The days that followed did not feel like an ending, not in the way Caleb had once thought things ended, with noise or final words or something that marked the moment clear and sharp. Instead, it came in small shifts, quiet ones, the kind that settled into a place without asking to be noticed, and he began to see it not in what had changed, but in what no longer needed to. The fence held without checking. The barn door stayed true without adjustment. The land itself seemed to rest easier under the weight of being left alone, and inside the house, the rhythm they had found continued, steady and unforced. Eliza moved through each day with that same calm purpose. But now there was no question in it, no wondering what she was or what she carried. Only the quiet understanding that whatever it was, it belonged, and so did she. One evening, as the lights settled low across the field, Caleb came in later than usual, the work taking him farther out than he had planned, and when he stepped through the door, the warmth met him the same as always. But something else did too, something smaller, but no less certain. The table was set as it had been every night, 2 plates, 2 cups, but this time there was a third thing, a small piece of cloth laid between them. Not decoration, not necessary, just there, soft against the wood. And he paused a moment, taking it in, not because it changed anything, but because it showed something had already changed without him needing to mark it. Eliza stood by the stove, her hand resting lightly on the edge as she looked toward him, not waiting, not questioning, just present, and he crossed the room without speaking, setting his hat down on the same peg it had come to rest on each night. The motion familiar now, shared in a way it had not been before. They sat at the table together, not as strangers filling space, but as 2 people who had come to understand the shape of it. And when he reached for his plate, he noticed she did not begin until he had settled, Not out of habit, not out of expectation, but because that was how it had become. The quiet between them held steady. But it was no longer something to move through. It was something to remain within. "You could have left," he said after a while, the words coming without weight, just placed where they belonged. She looked at him then, not surprised, not guarded. "Yes," she answered, "and nothing more," and he nodded. Once, accepting it without needing to hear what came next, because what came next was already here, in the way she stayed, in the way she had chosen this place not as something to pass through, but as something to remain with. Outside, the wind moved soft across the land, the same as it always had, but now it felt like part of something held rather than something empty, and Caleb leaned back slightly in his chair, his hand resting on the table, closer to hers than before, not touching, not reaching, just there, and she did not move away from it, did not close the distance either. She simply allowed it. And that was enough, more than enough, because it said what words did not need to. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the fire burned low, they stood for a moment in that same shared quiet, the house around them no longer something separate from them, but something shaped by both. And Caleb realized that whatever had brought her here, whatever had followed her from a place he might never fully understand, it had not only settled the question of the land, it had answered something in him too, something he had not known he was waiting for, not loudly, not all at once, but in the slow, steady way that things become what they are meant to be without needing to be forced. And beside him, Eliza Whitmore remained exactly as she had always been, quiet, certain, and entirely her own. But now she was no longer standing at the edge of his life. She was part of it, as sure and steady as the ground beneath the house they both now called home. There is a kind of quiet that only comes after something is settled for good, not the kind that waits for change, but the kind that knows it has already happened. And that was the quiet that rested over the ranch in the days that followed. Not empty, not heavy, just steady, like the land itself had found its place again and did not need to question it anymore. Caleb noticed it first in the mornings. The way the light came through the window and did not feel cold, the way the fire was already burning without needing to be coaxed back from ash, and the way the table stood ready with two plates that no longer felt like a gesture, but like a truth that had always been there waiting to be seen. Eliza moved through those mornings the same as she always had, her hands sure, her steps quiet, but now there was no distance left between what she was and what he understood her to be, no gap to close, no question to ask, just the simple presence of someone who had chosen to remain. One afternoon, as the sun stretched long across the fence line, Caleb stood out near the far edge of the property, looking over the land that had once felt like something he had to hold on to with both hands, something that could be taken if he was not careful enough. But now it felt different, not because it could not be lost, but because it was no longer his alone to stand for, and that changed the weight of it in ways he had not expected. Behind him, he heard the soft crunch of footsteps over dry ground, and he did not turn right away. He did not need to. He knew it was her, and when she came to stand beside him, not close, not far, just where she always seemed to be, he let out a slow breath that carried more than the moment itself. "It holds," he said, not speaking only of the land, and she nodded once, her gaze moving across the same horizon. "Yes," she answered, and that was enough, more than enough, because it was not agreement, it was confirmation, something already known. They stood there for a while without speaking, the wind moving soft through the grass, the fence standing straight, the house behind them holding its quiet warmth. And in that stillness, Caleb understood something he had not known how to name before, that what had come into his life did not arrive with force or demand. It arrived quietly, steadily, and stayed because it was meant to, not because it needed to be held. When they returned to the house that evening, the light low and golden, the table waited as it always did, 2 plates, 2 cups, and that small cloth between them, and he noticed how natural it felt now to take his place there, not as a man who had taken a wife, but as one who had been met, fully, without pretense or need for anything more than what was real. Eliza sat across from him, her hands resting lightly near her plate, and when their eyes met, there was no question left in either of them, no distance to measure, only the quiet understanding of 2 people who had come to stand in the same place without losing who they were. And as the night settled around the house, the fire low, the world beyond the walls fading into dark, Caleb realized that whatever others might have called her before, whatever names had been given in places that did not see her clearly, none of it remained here, not in this house, not on this land. Here she was not something to be judged or measured, not something to be questioned or held at a distance. Here she was simply what she had always been, and for the first time, he understood that some people are not meant to be touched by the world in the usual way, not because they stand apart from it, but because they carry something within them that changes the way the world must approach them. And as he reached for his cup, his hand resting for a brief moment closer to hers than ever before, not touching, but not pulling back either, he knew that this place, this quiet, this shared space, it was no longer something he had built alone. It was something they now held together, steady, certain, and entirely their own.